So now I'm going to go through the Maxwell UI and also give you some tips about using some of the tools here in the camera and multi-light. So first of all, you have the row of buttons here on top, which is basically the same as the file menu here. So open MXS, open MXI, save MXI, resume an MXI. So besides just opening an MXS and resuming it, you can also resume by opening an MXI file. So that's all this does. You can merge MXIs, and I'm going to talk about that in a lesson about network rendering. So you can render the same image on several computers. So each of those computers will give you a slightly different MXI, and then you can later merge them so that you may augment the sampling level. So, for example, if you have two computers with the same CPU and you render for 1 hour, then you merge their MXIs, it's as if you had rendered 2 hours on one computer. So that's a very nice thing about network rendering in Maxwell, is that it's very linear. It scales very well even if you add a lot of computers, because with different renders, as soon as you start adding, say, 5 or 6, 7 computers, you're not going to get the same benefit. It sort of drops off with more computers you add. But with Maxwell, it's almost always linear. So 2 computers twice as fast, 4 computers 4 times as fast, and so on. So then you can manually merge these MXI files without actually going through the network render. But it's out of the scope for this particular video. I'm going to talk about this in a video about network rendering. The image button lets you load a low dynamic range image into Maxwell Render, such as a JPEG or an 8-bit or 16-bit PNG or TIFF file, for example. So why would you want to load an image into Maxwell Render? Well, it has to do with emitters, and the thing is that in Maxwell you can have an emitter based on an image. So for example, just to show you quickly, if I create an emitter material and I apply it to this plane here, and let me change the camera parameters so it's more visible. So you can see here in the emission, instead of color, I can choose an HDR image, so a high dynamic range image. And for this to work, you have to first transform the low dynamic range image, or convert it into a high dynamic range image, or at least a fake high dynamic range image, because it's not really going to be a true high dynamic range image. But if you try to load the JPEG or low dynamic range image directly here, you can see that in this tutorial folder I have this JPEG of a sunflower, but in the dialog box in Studio here I can't see it because it expects a MXI, EXR, HDR or 32-bit TIFF. So in order for that sunflower image to show up, we have to first convert that sunflower JPEG into a sort of a fake HDR image by opening it in Maxwell. So if I click the load image button and I go to this folder and load the JPEG of the sunflower, all I have to do really is just either save MXI as, or so it's going to save it as an MXI file, or just save image and save it in one of the high dynamic range formats such as EXR or HDR, and save it as a 32-bit image. And once you do that, you can then load it in the image here, sunflower EXR. So in this case I saved it as an EXR file, and it loads it, and now you can see that it's emitting light in the colors based on that image. So that can be very useful for doing things like TV screens or LCD monitors or billboards and things like that. So just keep in mind that it only accepts HDR images. So you don't have to go through Maxwell to do this. You can also very well go through Photoshop and just save it as a 32-bit HDR file. One thing to note though is that it's always better to have a true HDR image if you're going to use an image emitter. And what I mean by that is that, for example, if you want to fake window light coming in from this side, it's always better to take photos of a window at different exposures and then merge those exposures to create an HDR image, a true high dynamic range image. And I'm going to go through how to do that in later lessons when I talk about emitters. But in many cases, you will not have access to the high dynamic range version of an image, or you simply find an image online that you want to use. In that case, this is the only way to go. Finally, the Save Image button. That should be obvious what it does. It allows you to save your render as a bitmap, but a few tips to mention about this button. So if you click it and you save the image, if you just save it without specifying a suffix, then it will save by default as PNG. Or you can just say, choose from the list here, or type the actual file type that you want. And if I choose a TIFF, for example, click Save, and you can choose the bit depth, so 8-bit, 16-bit, or 32-bit, so that would be the high dynamic range version. But I always save files as 16-bit, but because it allows you a little bit more precision when you work on post-production in Photoshop, so you have more info to work with compared to 8-bit. So I always save as 16-bit, and then it asks you, do you want to embed the channels in the image? So this render actually contains a lot of different alpha channels, and you can choose to embed them in the TIFF file itself because TIFF supports extra channels. And if you choose yes, and it will save the file, but then if you try to open this in Photoshop, you will see that you don't see those channels anywhere. So the problem here is not so much Maxwell, but the way Photoshop reads and writes TIFF files. So the way Maxwell saves the TIFF file is it saves the channels into something called pages inside the TIFF file, and this is actually what the TIFF specification says. But Photoshop can't read those pages in the TIFF file for some strange reason. And also when Photoshop saves TIFFs, it saves the extra channels as layers, so it does its own thing with the TIFF file. But you can see that if I show you this TIFF file in a image viewer, so here I'm using XNView, which is a great free image browser. And here's the TIFF file. If I double click it, it tells me that it contains multiple pages. If I click OK, if I go to Tools, multi-page file, and click Edit multi-page TIFF, you can see here that all those extra channels have been saved. So this is one page per each light or emitter, because it was I had multi-light activated, and also all those extra alpha channels. So everything is there. Maxwell saved the TIFF file correctly, but for some strange reason, Photoshop, even the latest versions, can't read those pages. So anyway, the good news is that starting with version 3.2, you can also choose to save an image as PSD. So then directly you have all those layers, and it's just a normal PSD file with all your layers inside of it. So that's really the best option, starting from version 3.2 to just save it as a PSD and you're good to go. The preview panel here may be somewhat obsolete starting with version 3, because in version 3 something called fast multi-light preview was added, and that makes it so instead of seeing a small thumbnail here of your render whenever you change something in the multi-light settings or the simulant settings, you now see the changes happening in real time in the main render view, and that uses your GPU and the RAM on your GPU. So the more RAM you have on your GPU, the bigger you can have a render in an MXI file and still have the main render view real-time update. So you can see as I'm moving the slider up and down here, it's actually using the GPU to do that in real time. And you can see here a yellow preview note here. And that lets you know that while this is yellow like this, it's using the GPU. And then actually when you let go of the slider, it's going to go back to using the CPU to render the final look of your render, which will be a little bit more accurate, and you're going to get the true look of your render as soon as that yellow preview node disappears, because then it switches automatically back to using the CPU to calculate the final values here. So for this render, because it's pretty small, you can see that when I let go of a slider, it doesn't take very much for it to switch to CPU mode and give me the true preview. But if you're using a larger MXI file, this delay may be a little bit longer, and it may get annoying to always have to wait that little bit for it to switch back to CPU rendering. So in order to avoid that, just go to File, Preferences, and then uncheck this check mark here, Automatic Update after editing. What happens now is that it's not going to automatically switch to the CPU when you make any changes. So you can see here that everything I do is now instantaneous with no wait time. And once I'm happy with my changes, then I have to manually click here the refresh button, and now it's going to render it multi-light effects with the CPU to get the true render. So, it depends. If you have a very fast computer, especially with dual or quad CPU, then it may make no difference whether you have this on or off. So then I suggest you simply have it on all the time, so you don't have to keep pressing the refresh button. On the other hand, you may have a large MXI where it will be more convenient for you to switch it off, so it's not so annoying, this little wait time. And I have to mention that the difference between this GPU and the CPU rendering really is minimal. I mean, you have to watch it very carefully most of the times to see a change. For example, if I press the refresh button now, you can see there it changed, and there's a very, very subtle change. And usually you will see a bigger change if you have a very high exposure. Then you will see a bigger difference between the preview GPU render and the CPU render. And finally, one important note is that if you load an MXI which doesn't fit, it's too big to fit in your graphics card's RAM, then Maxwell will automatically switch the fast multi-light preview off, and then you have to work like in pre-version 3 way, meaning you'll get a small thumbnail here, and you have to watch that when you make any changes. And also in the console panel, you get a notice saying that the MXI is too big, and I'm switching to the older way of previewing multi-light. And these days, a graphics card has maybe 2 or 4 gigabytes of RAM, so you can get pretty large MXI renders to fit into that RAM. But let's say an MXI that's for print, so maybe it's 5,000 pixels wide by 4,000 pixels high, then there's a big chance that it's not going to fit in your GPU's RAM, even if it has 4 or 6 gigabytes of RAM. Moving on to the camera and render options panels. And by the way, if you don't see these panels, just go to Window and you see all these panels here and turn them on and off. And it's the same UI principles as in Studio. You can rescale the panels, you can click and drag by the title bar to reposition them, or maybe put them over here and so on. So it's exactly like in Maxwell Studio. The same with the sections can be collapsed and so on. So if I load an MXI, you can see here that once the MXI is loaded, also the camera parameters that were used for that render are loaded, and you can see here some information about the shutter speed used and so on in the camera panel. And you can see that the MXI looks a little bit faded, and that has to do with the response curves here used for the tone mapping. So in any case, I will mention this a lot more in the post-production phase, but here you can, for example, choose a different response curve based on different film stocks and so on. So you can see here the changes that are made when you choose these different response curves. Here at the bottom, you can choose to turn on scattering and so on. So in the render options panel, basically this is a mirror of the same render options that you find in the plugins or in the render options here in Studio. Of course, for the different sections in each panel, I will go through these in more detail in future lessons. Next is the multi-light panel. So this is where all your emitters, including physical sky and sun and image-based emitters and regular emitters, all of these will get a slider in your scene, and you can update them in real time. Also the ISO and the shutter speed of the camera in order to change the exposure. And starting with version 3.2, you can also shift click the sliders. So for example, if I choose this one and then shift click all the way here, you can see that all of these have become outlined. And now if I change one, all of these will change proportionally. So you can see that if you have, it can be a little bit strange if you have very wide-ranging units here. So be a little bit careful sometimes, and especially if you're using emitters of different types. So here, if I click somewhere to uncheck these, I can bring these back to normal. Because these are much too sensitive. And also you can control click instead to just pick some of them. So this one and this one, for example, and I can change that, both of them at the same time. I'm going to talk about the rest of the options here. For example, creating a multi-light animated sequence and so on in later lessons. I just wanted to point out regarding the UI that you can also go into options here, view, and choose layout horizontally. So you may prefer this, for example, in docket here, let's say, so that you can work like this. Perhaps you prefer that for some renders. So that's about it for the UI for the multi-light panel. And please don't forget one important panel here, the console panel, which I usually dock with multi-light. So I have two tabs here. You should always look here in the console panel if you suspect something is wrong or the render doesn't start or so on. Just usually you get an error message, and Maxwell is pretty thorough about telling you exactly what is going on with your scene, and if it's stuck somewhere, or you get any error messages in red, or you get any warnings in bold yellow text. So always try to keep the console panel open. A few tips about the main render window. So you can see here at the bottom, first of all, a readout and your current zoom level. So when you hover your mouse over a part of it, you can see the exact values, the RGB values. And by scrolling your mouse wheel, you can zoom in and out. And when you have an MXI that's bigger than the current render view, you can hold down the mouse wheel to pan your render. Or you can also right click and choose pan, or use the P shortcut key. And by the way, two shortcut keys I use all the time are F and H, and that stands for full screen. And press F again to go out of full screen, and H to hide or unhide the panels. And one thing to watch out for is that if you now close Maxwell with the panels closed, the next time Maxwell will open, it will open with the panels hidden. So in that case, you know that you probably need to press H again to bring them back. So just keep that in mind, because I know new users are a bit surprised by that and think that each time they have to go and reopen each of the panels, and that's not the case. Just make sure you press the H shortcut key again to bring the panels back. In the right click menu, you have a few options. Just take note that select here is not currently used for anything. So you have the zoom in and out if you wish to zoom with the shortcut keys, but I find it a lot easier with the middle mouse button. Rotate, so you can rotate your render around if you think you might find a better vantage point or you may need that for some reason. Previous and next alpha custom. For this to work, you need to actually be in a channel view, and to do that you need to hover over this little circle here, and A stands for custom alpha. So when you do that, you can see the alpha channels if there are any in the render. So if you have any alpha channels or extra channels, each of them will appear in their own little circle here. So R stands for the main render, A, the lower caps A stands for custom alphas. And now if I press shift and the left and right keyboard keys, I can move through all the different custom alpha channels that are in the render. Because by default, it will only show, I think, the first alpha channel on the list if you have several custom alpha channels. So this is a way to see all of them. And then just hover over the little R circle again to bring back the main render. Further down, if you see your color displays, you can switch the little RGB display here, or you can click to 16-bit, 32-bit RGB or hue saturation values. So now when you hover, you can see that it shows you the values in 16-bit. So 16-bit means around 65,000 values instead of just 256 in the 8-bit mode, or for 8-bit images. And finally, the out of range colors can be quite useful. If you switch it on and, for example, you change a setting, it's going to bring you up this red overlay telling you that some of these values are going to be out of range and they're completely white. So they're overexposed, but you know, just don't try to minimize them all the way, because some parts, for example, these metallic shiny parts here, are supposed to be blown out. So don't try to get rid of these, because then the metals won't look realistic anymore. But anyway, you can see here, at least get an idea of which parts will be overexposed, and you may have to play with the exposure a little bit before you go and save an image out, a low dynamic range image from the render.